Since the great financial crisis, investors have started to pay more and more attention at the course of action of central banks, and they've also started incorporating more and more these policies into their asset allocation process. Why is that? Because depending on where we are in the business cycle and the response of central banks, it's not that difficult to predict how risk assets will perform in the short term. To better understand how central banks' decisions affect asset classes, Allianz AM has developed the good news, bad news quadrants. This is essentially a blueprint with 4 scenarios delimited by 4 quadrants in this orthogonal space. And here we have 2 variables really. First, the health of the economic data flow measured on the horizontal axis, and the performance of risk assets such as equities or CDS spreads measured on the vertical axis. Let's look at them in order. First quadrant, so top right, we see the good news is good news quadrant, meaning that economic data is reassuring, is improving, but we don't have inflation yet because the economy is not hot enough, so nobody expects higher interest rates. This is also referred to as the Goldilocks scenario from the tale of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, meaning that it's an ideal environment because economic data supports earnings and profits, and low inflation means high consumer confidence. In this scenario, we have encouraging economic indicators, equities are up and rates are flat. We experienced this type of scenario from 2017 until mid of 2021, more or less. Just below in the second quadrant, we have good news is bad news. Economic data is very strong, but this means that the economy is overheating and we are possibly reaching the peak stage in the business cycle. Equities just had a very good run, so investors start to get nervous about valuations being stretched. Typically at this time inflation starts to show up as well, so people get more nervous because they anticipate more aggressive policy from central banks, and this means higher interest rates. An example of such scenario can be given by the 6-7 months in between the end of 2021 and the start of 2022, when there was this widespread debate about the nature of inflation and whether central banks were reacting strongly enough or not. And as it's typical in these situations, risk assets tend to trend downwards or they move sideways, as you can see in this chart. So we have good economic news in terms of GDP growth and earnings, but bad risky asset performance because of inflation and higher rates. Third quadrant in the bottom left shows the bad news is bad news scenario. This happens when central bank policy starts to work and cools the economy down. And in fact, the economic data that comes out looks terrible. So unemployment is up, production stalls, and we see downgrades in earnings and profits. Obviously, share prices reflect that everything just looks terrible, so bad news translates into bad news overall. We can argue that this is the next step for us. This is what we're heading towards. The only positive in this scenario is that inflation starts to peak because it has reached its maximum level. And basically it's that famous argument by which the best cure for high prices is high prices and the recession. Last quadrant is the bad news equals good news scenario, and that's really what you look forward to when you are in a recession. The moment when things are so they can't get any worse. Here we are at the trough phase, if you remember my video on the business cycle, and the positive spin on this is that inflation has mostly gone, and so central banks have the firepower to get things started again. This typically means lowering interest rates, which supports valuation, and that's why you start to see an uptick in equities again. At present times, we seem to be in a good news is bad news scenario. For example, beginning of last week, we had an economic release of GDP growth in May, year on year for the UK, which was 0.5%, ahead of the expected 0.1%. And on one hand, this is obviously a good sign because it means that output is still 2% ahead of pre-pandemic levels, and so the economy is not collapsing. But the problem here is that the hotter the economy looks, the higher expected inflation and the more severe the course of action of the Bank of England. And that is precisely why the FTSE 100 sold off in the hours following the economic release. So that was everything for today. I hope that you found this interesting and useful. As ever, I thank you so much for watching this far. It really means a lot to me. I wish you a very good week, and I'll see you soon.